This is Big Ideas from the ABC.
So the first point I want to raise is a very obvious question. The panel's called mandatory attention. Obviously, it's playing on the words mandatory detention, and I think it's asking us whether we need to be paying any or at least more attention to what's going on at the moment. But in the program, it's specified as being from white Australia policy to mandatory detention. And I think if this panel was generated in more recent weeks, we probably would have also factored in what's been happening in recent weeks. So I'm going to invite my fellow panelists to give their insights into recent events if they would like to. I want to make two very quick points. The first point is broadly about Australia and this really common question that we get asked a lot, is Australia racist? And it just so happens that I've been in China for the last 2 weeks, and I met a Chinese filmmaker who told me that he came to Australia and he made a documentary film and asking the question, are Australians racist? And he said the most common response he got was, how can I be racist? I'm talking to you. So he said to me that that is a kind of a trope. It's an Australian condition. And it seems to broadly, in my opinion, represent in its own right just how racist we are. I think talking to another human being is almost like the basic social contract. When you're born, it's just assumed that you'd be at the very least willing to do that. But if you think you deserve points because you're speaking to someone because they're Asian or Arab or African, then I think that it recognizes that there is an inherent problem. But they are not my observations. They're the observations of one of my peers who I had the privilege of meeting in recent weeks. The other point I wanted to raise is that usually when we're talking about racism, we talk about it like an isolated issue, which is actually the way we talk about most issues in this country. When we're talking about racism or sexism or heteroprivilege, or we're talking about class issues, we're usually talking about them as individual phenomena. And for that reason, what happens is someone like me, some guy like me will sit on a panel and talk about how hard it is for lebs, and then I'll go outside and someone will say to me, hey, that was great, but you didn't really factor in gender. And then you'll go to the gender panel across the road. And so there is a very important cultural theorist. If you don't know of her, you should all look into her. Her name is Bell Hooks, an African-American cultural theorist who says we need to start looking at issues of race, class, gender, sexuality, and disability through intersections, so that we're never really just talking about race as a separate phenomena from the other socio-political factors. And she kind of has an all-encompassing term for this. She says that when we want to look at it in its broadest capacity, we should be referring to white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. Now, how many people in this room actually represent white supremacist capitalist patriarchy? Hopefully no one. Unless you're Rupert Murdoch's grandson or something. Get out, by the way. But otherwise, most of us are usually negotiating one level of privilege against another. And so we're never really fixed in a static position. We're usually moving in and out of our privileges, negotiating our gender, our race, our class, our sexuality, and our abilities as we move through life. Having said that, the last point I want to make is about literature. We've been asked, what is our responsibility? Looking at these kinds of issues, what is our responsibility? And I can only interpret that from a literary perspective, as I hope my fellow panelists will, because we're at a literary festival. And to that end, I want to raise a question now to my peers, and then I hopefully will be able to give my insights into literature and the importance of literature. But so the two questions I have, and we'll start with Yassmin, is firstly, what is your position, your feelings, your thoughts on the current climate, starting, if you want, with the White Australia policy all the way up till now? What is your position, your feelings on that? And then what do you think our responsibilities are, particularly through the lens of literature, as literary people?
Thanks for the nice, specific questions there. Look, it's fascinating because I think for me, Australia is a place of contradictions. Like I was born overseas. I was born in Sudan, and so people, I was in a cab yesterday, and the guy was like, "Where are you from?" I'm like, "Oh, Brisbane." Where? Oh, okay. whereabouts? Oh, the south side of Brisbane. And he was like, so what about your parents? And, and almost every cab I get into, you get asked these questions. And to be honest, like, you can't blame them, right? You can't, I think I try to find a balance between understanding the fact that, I don't always want to be judged by all the different kind of things that I represent, but at the same time, people are trying to fit me into whatever kind of little boxes they have in their mind. I don't like fitting into boxes, so I'm like, oh, whatever. But the idea is that I quite like the concept of intersectionality and sort of looking at all of those different things. But Australia, my parents picked Australia to migrate to, my dad said, because when he was traveling, as a young Sudanese guy, the nicest people that he met, the kindest people that he met on his travels were Australian, right? And so, he always has this one example of, somebody in the UK was like fallen on the street or whatever, and everyone walked past, but the only people that stopped were him, apparently, and a couple of Australians. And so for him, Australia represented a place where people, regardless of what they looked like, were able to make it. And also my mum had a pen pal in Brisbane, so that was convenient. But on the other side, if we look at, you say start at the White Australia policy, but it goes beyond that. I think if we look at from the get-go, how I guess Anglo-Australia has come about, that I asked this question to somebody I respected recently about the contradiction in Australia, why we're so seemingly proud of being multicultural, but at the same time have a lot of sort of defensiveness about our multiculturalism. And the response was, she thinks that Australia has a deep vein of racism that we don't ever really acknowledge, which, it sounds a little bit depressing, but I think in some cases it can be as bad as you want it to be. I think Australians, and it's so, every Australia Day we have the discussion about what is an Australian. So to say Australians just broadly is hard enough. But generally, we like to be proud of the idea that, I got a Muslim friend, mate, like old Yassmin over here, old Mohammed, he's all right. But then, so it's kind of like this sort of general racism, but not specifically. So you can be friends with all of these different people, but I had a good friend of mine from high school post up on Facebook recently, and they were like, blah, 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 these Muslims, blah, 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 they should get out. And I'm like, yo, what about me? He was like, look, you're different. It's the rest of them that are the problem. And that, for me, was the tough part. It's like, if the fact that you know me and you know the fact that I represent all of these things doesn't change your mind, what will? On the other hand, though, I have a good friend of mine from Ipswich who, I don't know if you guys know Ipswich, but it's a place that can engender some let's say, bogan views. We'll just go with that broad term. And he said to me, and he works in the army, he does all the sort of things that you would associate with a particular mindset. But he's so pro-asylum seeker, so pro, I guess, having Muslims around, whatever it may be. And he said to me recently, and he was posting this stuff up on Facebook again, and he said to me, Yassmin, when I joined uni, because I met him at university, I had all the views that I now despise. But the fact that I knew you and the fact that I got to know you meant that I had to decide whether or not to keep holding those views or somehow live with this cognitive dissonance. And so because I'd asked him, like, do you think people really can change? And he was like, well, I did. So I think for me, it's easy to be angry. And I think there are a lot of people, say, broadly in the Muslim community that are angry because, we've grown up in a society where simply because of what we believe in, we're judged by a whole range of things. And so the default is to feel like a victim and to feel angry and mad because, this is Australia, I'm from Australia, I have nowhere else to go, yet people here don't accept me. And if you live with a decade plus of that, you're going to end up taking some of that on. But I also think that at the same time, we have a responsibility as people in the community, as a minority, and also as writers, in the sense that, I can't expect other people, unfortunately, I can't expect other people to just educate themselves about me or about where I'm from or about all these sort of things. If I want people to know, I should be out there doing things and telling people and explaining. And yes, it's frustrating having to explain. And yes, it's frustrating that you constantly have to apologize. But whoever said life was fair?
Can I ask you, sorry, we'll get to the other panelists in a second, but you talk about your responsibility as a writer to educate people. That's great. What about non-Muslims? What are their responsibilities?
This is tough, right? Because Australians in particular, I think, don't like to be told what to do. Like, I hate being told what to do. And Australians are like, Australians, I think, well, I work with a lot of guys on oil and gas rigs, and they're guys that mostly have left school before finishing, grade 10 or 12. And so there's quite a strong view of, I don't want you changing the way I live my life. And it's very the sort of independent, kind of individualistic mindset. What are, I guess, a non-Muslim's responsibility? It's to be part of the conversation that's open-minded. It's to be, if you hold a view or a perspective that's different to what the mainstream is, make sure other people know that, because unfortunately, the messenger is so important as well. I can go on and on and on about, the difficulties that women face and that people of color face, but it'll take someone who fits all the right things, like Emma, Hermione, right? To stand up at a place like the UN and for people to listen to her, because she's relatable. So if you're part of the mainstream, if you're part of the, I can go on, as I said, about issues that Muslims face, but sometimes it'll take a non-Muslim to say the same thing that I'm saying, to amplify that. And I guess that's just the way life is.
Yeah, okay, so this is a very broad topic. I'm going to try and keep this within the confines of the asylum seeker policy. And I think what I think of as racism within Australia, I think of also as a fear of the other. And this idea that a lot of people have a fear of the other. I think the majority of the world have a fear of the other. And our role as a society is to educate people that you shouldn't be scared of this other. And in this case, at the moment, it's Islamophobia, is the Islam world. Previously, it was communism. Before that, it was WOGs, or after that, it was WOGs. Excuse that term, I'm just using it. And when you allow that fear of the other to be fostered and legitimized, and you promote that fear and say it's okay to fear that other, that's when you get people saying horrible things. So they go, oh, it's okay to say horrible things. That's what everyone else thinks. While if you have people saying, so let's take the asylum seeker issue, for example. If you have politicians and people in power and media telling you that these people are illegals and these people are queue jumpers, well then it's okay to put a person who's an illegal in prison. If you call these people desperate people asking for protection, then it's not okay to put them in a prison. And so I think language plays a huge part in the way we approach this idea of fear of other, language and education. And I don't want to move on to the responsibility question just yet, but that's why literature can be so influential. And it's the reason why I wrote my book. I'll go into it now. When I was in Nauru, I began writing as a way of reacting to the...
Sorry, I just interrupt you. Why don't you tell everybody what your experience was that led to your book?
Okay, so I worked in the Nauru Regional Processing Centre, and I was quite naive before ever going to Nauru about the real issues about asylum seekers. I did get educated just before going, but in going over there, I started to hear these stories and see the situation of these people. They're more or less locked up in a detention centre 4 hours off the coast of Brisbane, and they're left there indefinitely with no idea of what will happen to them, how they can leave, when they'll be able to go to Australia, if they'll ever get to Australia. And so in this detention centre, to keep it very short, you started to see situational mental illnesses arise out of this concept of lack of autonomy of your future, and the concept that you have no progress and no hope. And that's the point of these deterrence policies, and the point of these detention centres is to crush that hope that they can get to Australia, to make them go back to their home countries. That's essentially the idea behind them. And so in being in these detention centres and seeing these men break down and harm themselves and attempt suicide and lose their minds, the way I dealt with that trauma was to write about it. And having written about it, I showed people my work and started to realise that I had a way of showing people this dark and mysterious world that we're not allowed to see. And when I first started writing, I had a friend of mine, Wendy Bacon, who's a journalist, say, you should release this in 5 parts and put it to the media. But at that point I realised that the media it gets forgotten every day. And I'd seen people speak out to the media who I worked with, lose their job, lose their career, and then be forgotten the next day. And the articles not have any impact. And so I wanted to create something that made people invest their time. And that's what a book does. When you read a book, it's like a contract. You say, I'm going to buy a book and I'm going to spend this 10 hours reading it. And I wanted to encapsulate everything that happened in this camp and how these men were feeling. I think we've gone a bit off topic, but that's essentially what I did in Nauru.
No, we're not off the topic. So look, you feel like you had a responsibility to do that?
It was a responsibility to myself and the men, but I didn't expect every other person in Nauru to do that. I was in a very privileged position where I had no dependents, I had no real career, I had no house, no children, no mortgage. If I was to be fired the next day, I could go home and live with my parents. There were people there who were, had families to look after, and people who were scared of the government going after them. And so I think, for me personally, I felt that I needed to do this, and I felt the responsibility to the men that I worked with to tell their stories. And unfortunately, as you said, they couldn't tell their stories because they're not in a position to do that. So as a white Australian male, I had that opportunity, and I felt obligated because of my birthright as a white Australian male to give back because of all the luck that I had.
So can we stay on this discussion for a little while? There's a lot of debate at the moment, particularly in the area of cultural studies and literary studies, about writing the other, representing somebody that is not you. Particularly, it comes up when you're writing using your own words from a privileged position. So what is your perspective? I extend this to the entire panel. What is your perspective on writing the other, or writing somebody in a less privileged position than you? Firstly, do you think it's okay to do it? And then secondly, if so, what is the culturally sensitive way to do it?
So many feels.
Wow, that is a tough one. So I'm just going to talk about from my background and how it relates. Is that I'm part Indigenous, but I'm also part a lot of other things. And one of the things that people expect me to do often, especially at festivals around Australia, is speak on behalf or on a soapbox on behalf of Indigenous Australians. And I don't have that capability, and I don't believe that I have that responsibility, and I don't believe that I have that authority to speak on behalf of anybody else. However, I do speak on behalf of my perspective and my opinion, and what I always hope is that I can write something which is about policies, in particular government policies surrounding Indigenous issues. And that maybe someone somewhere out there will read what I've written or hear what I've written and be able to relate to it and take something away from it and maybe change somebody's point of view if they do have an opposing one to mine, which I think maybe the idea of your book, of Mark's book, is speaking from his opinion, and I'm speaking for you, sorry, speaking from his opinion and his perspective on things, and hoping that it will go out there to the world, putting it out there, somebody will pick it up, read it, and change somebody's opinion or point of view. And I think that's the culturally appropriate way of writing on behalf of the, other, as opposed to, like, you see a lot of literature, and I am going to talk about, and I hope Tim Winton's not here. But you will find that when he, in particular one of his books, when he writes about, people of colour, he mythologicalizes them, if that's even a word, mythicizes them rather than gives them their own, they don't have their own voice. And obviously the reason they don't is because he's not of that ethnic background. Of whoever he's talking about. So he puts them in a different light. Whereas I think if you're writing about your experiences in a certain situation, then it's okay.
Yeah, so with that, my book was my experiences and my perspective on this camp. But at the same time, I believed I was giving a voice to these people who are voiceless. They don't have a way of getting their voices out there. And if they do, it's potentially punishable with never becoming a refugee in Australia. And so I do believe I was representing them with their full support, and that was a necessity for me publishing the book. But it's a very fine line between telling their story and telling my story, and so I tried to avoid that.
And that definitely is part of the privilege that you have of being in your position, which is exactly the privilege that I have, is that people do invite me to come around Australia and speak at festivals on these issues, whereas they might not invite somebody who, you know, doesn't speak English that great from an Aboriginal community, which, like I said, I don't want to speak on behalf of that person, but maybe if I can tell somebody that these things are going on, that they might come and see for themselves or come to a different opinion.
And sorry, just one more thing. And with my story as well, I think in some ways it's more accessible for Australian audiences that I'm trying to talk to when they hear about, you know, a guy that they can relate to, a young male who everyone knows a white young male in Australia. Oh, okay, that could be my friend. And it's much more relatable in that sense. And I think people can digest it much easier in some ways.
So this is a particularly sensitive one, I think, for me personally, in the sense that I probably am part of a group that everybody loves speaking on behalf of. And literally everyone has an opinion, right? And so it's fascinating, particularly sort of just like the idea of Muslim women. I guess everyone thinks that they can have a voice for them. And something we're particularly sensitive about as a group is, well, I mean, and there are so many nuances to that group, as you were. But look, I think that it's so important for people to have a space to talk on behalf of themselves. I think it's an unfortunate reality of where we live and the kind of society that we live in that doesn't always get heard by the people who need to hear it the most. And I also think that it's a mistake for people to think that just because, I guess something that's really frustrating, for example, is, so I'm from Sudan, and I know loads of people who are like, oh, yep, so I went to Sudan for like a month, or, you know, I went to a place in Africa for a month, therefore I know all things. I was schooled by a guy the other day who was like, mate, this is how you say, you know, Zimbabwe or something, you know, and I was just like, dude, like, so many things are wrong with this. And he was like, I really love Africa. I've spent 2 years there, and I know all the things. I'm like, dude, it's not a country. Let's start with that. And so I guess it's I mean, for example, there's something at the moment called Women in Solidarity with Hijabi. So I guess this idea of women who are putting the scarf on to kind of, you know, stand up with their Muslim sisters. So that's really well intentioned, right? And I've got good friends that are trying to do that, and you know, or the story of a lady putting on a niqab and being like, oh my God, you know, now I know what it feels like to be a Muslim woman. Actually, you don't. And things like that are really frustrating in the sense that I know what they're trying to do. I know it's well intentioned. I know they're trying to experience a part of the world. But the thing is, they can take that off. You know, they can take it off and be then a part of normal society. They have the privilege, I guess, of becoming part of the greater group rather than always being defined by your minority. So the responsibility of having privilege, I think, is to recognize it. And you can't, like, so yes, I might be a whole lot of things that are minority, but I'm also privileged in that I'm educated. And I'm also privileged in that I have parents who allow me to do all sorts of things that a lot of other Muslim parents wouldn't let their daughters do, right? So I have privilege, and I think when you have privilege, your responsibility, and particularly as a writer, is to recognize that and to do the best you can. And a big part of it also is to have the permission and the support of the people that, you know, you can't claim to ever represent, but that you want to share their stories with, and hopefully provide them the opportunity for them to tell their own stories. There's nothing that'll beat a person telling their own story, because that is genuine and authentic and true. But if they can't, then you have to do it in a way that is, you know, that is cultural. And sometimes all you need to do is ask, can I write this about you? Is this how you feel? And offer the space for people to be able to not be orientalized. And that idea of, you know, the mythicizing, it's that, I remember when I read Edward Said's Orientalism, I was like, oh my God, my life is explained, right? Because all your life you're seen as the other. And the other isn't a human being. The other is an idea in your mind that you can apply all these things to. You're exotic and you're this and you're this and you're this, but you're never really a human in the same way.
Thank you. The panelist furthest to me has, let's go back to the original question that.
Can you ask it again?
Well, it was just broad. It was pretty much just recapping what the program says, right? So your position, your current position from white Australia to mandatory detention today.
Wow. Well, that is a big one. As a product, as a direct result of white Australia policies and of the practices followed by English people during colonial times, is that I can say that, wow, the concept of Australia, and it's interesting because it was mentioned earlier by my friend today when we were talking about, you know, Australia and Australia as a young country, with the, just in the word, I suppose, Australia, but it obviously, you know, goes back a lot further than that. And I think there is that fear. What were we talking about? We're talking about that fear that Australians today have of being recolonialised to a certain degree, and that a lot of, non-Indigenous Australians, and I use that term to cover like a lot, because Australians, the concept of an Australian is just ridiculous. Like, we're from everywhere, you know. I'm English, Irish, Scottish, Indigenous, Romani, Gypsy. So does that make me an Australian? Does that make me Australian enough? And I think the problem that we have, if you are somebody who has a little bit of something that makes you a little bit ambiguous, and people look at you like, oh, where are you from? That can be really confronting for people, because they do want to know where you are from and what makes you who you are. Yeah, that question straight up is sort of, I suppose, exemplifies the racism that is underlying in Australia, and I think that has to do with the post-colonial hangover of that sort of, not shame, of how Australia became what it is today, but just as a result of the fear of being recolonised by the, you know, whether it's we were worried, you know, I'm not saying we, I mean Australians, I obviously wasn't around, but during the time when we did have people coming into Australia from Middle Eastern country, or you know, from Eastern European countries and from China, you know, we were always worried that things were going to change, and we don't want change, and we fear change, and we sort of want to try and avoid as much change as humanly possible, while we're sort of suppressing that memory, you know, that really wasn't that long ago, of how we so drastically managed to change not only the physical landscape, but the biological landscape and makeup of what it is to be an Australian. And so rather than embracing new ideas and new cultures and new people coming into Australia and just adding to what has already been so completely and utterly fucked up from its original format, we're like, oh no, we don't want to change that. We're like really happy in being a Catholic, you know, country, which is ridiculous when you hear people say that we need to keep Australia a Christian country, because, like, really? I mean, as a non-religious person at all, I don't get that. You know, as a country like many colonialised countries that have had Christianity forced on them and have just adopted it so violently that we reject anything else now, and to the point where we have otherified, I'm making up words here, it's okay. We have otherified the traditional owners of the land that we inhabit now, and people will make you feel like an outsider. And I think that I do have the privilege to be able to go, oh, like I know people like me do go, oh no, you know, I'm not really Indigenous, you know, like, it's just my ancestry, I'm not really Indigenous. And you hear that a lot. And I think, and so it is my privilege to be able to do that. I could do that, but I refuse to. And when I was in school, I actually pretended to be Greek for a while because I was so scared of coming out, and it felt like that. And my father has said it in the same terms, coming out as an Indigenous person to people that you've managed to keep that a secret from. And so I did. So I pretended to be Greek. I've pretended to be a lot of things because I just didn't want to say it when I was little, because I knew it was offensive. However, in late 1993, early 1994, when Australia was going through the whole Mabo thing, and we started to see African people coming into Australia, which was amazing.
So I don't even know what this is.
You can do this, and that was amazing. So we had this time, and I remember growing up in Brisbane is that we all of a sudden we had like South African neighbours, and I thought it was great because we could share clothes. We were the same size, and I was like, yes, extra wardrobe because they were our friends. But at the same time, we had all this whole Mabo thing, and people was all this talk. Like I remember being really little, and people were talking in school about Aboriginal people are going to come and take our homes. And I grew up really, really poor, and I didn't have much, and so like we didn't have a home that we could call our own. And I remember thinking, I wonder if I'm going to get a house. If this Mabo thing goes through, I'm lucky. No, unfortunately, that didn't happen. And I kind of had it in my head. I was like, yeah, I'm part Indigenous. I can just rock up to someone's backyard. But no, as a 7-year-old, as a 7 or 8-year-old, that was how I thought was going to happen, because all the white kids at school were saying that's what was going to happen. I was like 3-part Aboriginal kids at school, and we were all just sitting there going, yeah, come on. So go Mabo, yeah. Not that at all, but when you're like 7 or 8, you don't really understand politics. So, got sidetracked. Where was I? Yes, so that's my opinion, is that we are afraid of embracing new ideas, and to paraphrase Cher from Clueless, we all just need to make some more room at the table when too many guests arrive for dinner, and you just like scooch over, bring in a stool and bung on another plate on the table, and just like everyone will be fine.
Just because I'm wary of time, I'll just take some closing remarks from Yassmin, Mark, and Laurie,
Yep.
And then we'll open it up to questions. Is that okay? But quick.
Sure. All right. Yeah. Cool. I guess in terms of bringing it back to the idea of mandatory attention or mandatory detention and the importance of language, I think the other thing that's really important is for us to, because all right, we're all in this room because we kind of agree, right? I hope anyway. I hope you do now. So the question is, how do we take where we are and move that beyond having a conversation within people that already kind of share the same opinion? How do we sort of amplify the messages that we're talking about, and all the acceptance and the change, et cetera, all the good things? And I think part of that, especially as people who write and people who are interested in literature, is taking control of that language, either re-owning it or using the right language, or the language that's accepted by the people that you're talking about, or in order to be able to change that message. And I think Mark's point was really pertinent. The idea of the language that we use around asylum seekers is poisonous. The language that we use around asylum seekers, no wonder, if you've never met an asylum seeker, if you don't have any, it's the same thing with Muslims, if you don't have any personal exposure, and all you hear about illegals and they want to take this and et cetera, like, of course you're going to feel frightened. Of course it's going to feel like the other. Of course it's the idea of that, the enemy that is difficult to personalize. But once you start to use language about protection, once you start to tap into the things that the person values, once you start to be like, hey mate, what aren't we about a fair go? Or are these people not, sort of breaking it down to what people can relate to, and then hopefully saying, I think the key thing is, when I previously mentioned the idea of Australians being sort of broadly racist but not specifically so, if a person knows enough asylum seekers and knows that they're all just good lads, good Aussie blokes or good Aussie Sheilas or whatever that Aussie Sheila may be, then they can no longer really have that contradiction in their mind. And that's how I know I've changed people's minds, by being like, hey mate, do you think I'm Australian? They're like, were you born here? I'm like, nah. And they're like, well, you sound pretty Australian, so you're all right? And so they're just like, their mind's just like, she doesn't look anything like she's supposed to. But I think we have enough within us as Australians to be able to make that change. Yes, we've got all sorts of history, but we're a young enough country that we're in this exciting time where we can make the country. Right? We actually are part of building this nation. And that is a privilege that not many other people have. Like, if you go to the UK, they've got centuries, man, of like, you know, class and hate and all sorts of stuff. That's hard to change. We're only really young, so people are still forming their prejudices, people are still forming their opinions, and so we do have that responsibility and privilege to change that language, to expose people to things that challenge them and hopefully change their minds.
I'll follow up from my previous point that I kind of rambled off on. But I think with this idea of the racism or the other, I think we've got examples of successful migration and successful migration of asylum seekers. If you're not aware, we had a very successful program migrating Vietnamese asylum seekers. And so it isn't the concept of deterrence and having to put people in detention centres and resettlement in Cambodia isn't the only solution. There are other ways. And what the situation is at the moment is we've created a concept where Australian people actually want harsher measures, and they're supporting, that they're saying that what we have in place is too fair. What actually happens is this whole concept of the Refugee Convention was based upon reactions to what happened to Jewish refugees in World War II, and the fact that we didn't take in Jewish refugees, they end up being killed. The idea is, if someone comes to your shores, irrespective of their mode of arrival, and asks for protection, you hear their story. If they need protection, you give them protection, and you don't return them to places where they fear persecution. What we've done is say, to stop people getting on boats because it's too dangerous for them, we're going to place them in detention centres before they've had their stories heard in a foreign country, several hours off the coast of Australia. We're going to leave them there for an indefinite period of time without telling them what will happen to them or what crime they've committed. And then eventually we resettle them to an impoverished nation. And in that meantime, if what we're trying to do is say, you will never get to Australia, and when I ask people, why do you continue waiting? They say, because we have this hope. One of the men described it to me as this pinprick of light in a dark world. And by eliminating that hope, that's the point of deterrence, to eliminate that kernel of hope within these people. You're either having them return to the persecution they fear, or you're having them attempt suicide in detention centres. And that's essentially what's happening. And we've done it before. We know exactly what happens in these places. We know the reason why we do it is because we know it eliminates hope. And this is our government, our policy, and this isn't the Liberal government, this isn't the Labor government, this isn't right wing, this is our government, our policy, our country. We know that this is happening. The information is out there. And it's not only up to the Australian government to change this, it's up to the Australian people. The point of a democracy isn't that you can go every 3 years to vote, is that you can lobby governments, you can have freedom of voice, freedom of protest. That is the point of a democracy. And so in terms of mandatory detention, it is our responsibility as privileged Australians, whatever your race, gender, religion, to stop these atrocities happening.
So my question, and it's a sincere one, to Mark, is what can literary people do? What is their role, and how do they participate in resistance and a response to this through literature, either as writers or as readers?
Yeah, very good question. I think it's a very difficult thing for writers to become involved in this debate, because what I think it really needs is to be empowering asylum seekers to have their own voice. And I think what we need is asylum seeker characters. And I hate referring to them as asylum seekers, but characters within literature, within movies, within television, within Australian entertainment industry, who have an identity as, you know, the girl who's dating John, who goes to the surf shack, but who also fled from persecution and came from Afghanistan. So it's not her identity, not defined by being a refugee, but as an element of her person.
I agree. I absolutely agree. But how? And I'm asking kind of rhetorically here. But how do you make that happen? How do you go from an industry that is, whether it's literature or television or film or visual arts, for example, or, theatre that is predominantly white? How do you bring people of colour, for example, refugees, migrants, indigenous people, into that world?
I mean, I think it's a slow integration. It's a similar thing when you look at the struggle for women and to be put into the mainstream media. I mean, they've been trying this for years and years, and we still have a predominantly male protagonist in all major films. I think it's like 80% to 20%. It's not something that will happen overnight. We're not just going to suddenly be going, oh, look, suddenly Home and Away is, full of people from Afghanistan. It doesn't work like that. It takes...
Home and Away? Sorry.
Well, if you're going to use Home and Away as an example, they've had about 25 years.
Yeah.
So what's wrong? I guess...
I think what it needs is, for one, we're actually going to see the people who were in detention, children in detention from the first round of Nauru, are now adults in Australia. And they're now actually represented in votes, in the business world, and they're actually part of Australian communities. And I think when you take that into perspective and you start meeting people who've had these stories and start recognizing that they're a part of our culture now, they're not just someone in a detention centre. They're actually growing up with us, and their children are talking to our children, and you start to hear their stories on a personal level. That's what's powerful. As you were saying, when you meet these people, you realise they're not asylum seekers. They're not, boat people. They're Mohammed from next door. And I think if we can explore that as much as possible, the humanising aspect of literature, that's how we can bring it across.
Laurie, do you want to offer some closing remarks, and also if you want to pick up where Mark left off as well?
Right, well, I think the reason that we have all these people stuck in these detention centres is obviously a result of what I was talking about before with the fear, and the fear of not only recolonialisation, but the fear of change. And the only way to overcome fear is to have open conversations and to meet people and to talk to people and to mingle, and like that's how you get over anything. If you have a fear of heights, you go rock climbing or something, and I think that's the same. So I feel like I'm talking a little bit creatively here, but I just think Australia needs to just go rock climbing and be up there, and I don't really have a lot to say on it because I just think the whole thing is ridiculous. I think the fact that we're putting people in detention centres for an indefinite period of time is ludicrous and outrageous, and I can't believe that this is 2014 and we're actually treating people so insanely badly rather than just having a conversation and making friends. And I think the whole thing is just about making friends. And then they do stop becoming that asylum seeker. Instead, they just become somebody that you know, and their beliefs and their lifestyle and whatever just becomes something about them, and you don't have to adopt it. I've got friends, I don't have to become whatever my friend is just because we're buddies. If it's a vegan or anything. I'm not all of a sudden going to be like, oh no, now I have to be a vegan because I've got vegan friends. And so that's pretty much. And so that's my closing remark, is that I think the whole thing is ridiculous, and I think the only way to make any change and move forward is to have conversations with people.
Yes.
And just really, really quickly, I think it's about picking up on that, making conscious choices to make space for people to share their voices, but also conscious choices in the language that you use, conscious choices in the characters that you decide to build. I mean, it's easy for us to go to characters that we're familiar with, but forcing ourselves to do things differently, because change is never comfortable, and that's it. The conversations will be difficult, and it's not always going to be in a space that we're comfortable with, because it'll challenge things about ourselves. It'll challenge things about what we understand of ourselves. But making those conscious choices to change our language and make space for other people as well. It even comes to, all right, I want to mentor a young writer. Well, am I going to pick someone who looks exactly like me, or am I going to make a conscious choice to do a difficult thing and maybe mentor someone who is completely different, but providing that opportunity for them? Because I think another part of it is that there's a lot of barrier to entry for a lot of these sort of things, and that comes with not having the privilege in terms of finding the right kind of work, or being able to have access to the right kind of media. Is people, if you're an asylum seeker, you have, or even really, really quick. I had a mate that migrated from South Africa, and her family was watching Channel 10 News for about a year because they didn't know that ABC or SBS existed. And like, no offense to Channel 10, but she said to me, she was like, I couldn't believe that this was the news that all of Australia was watching. They didn't even know what kind of media to access because you don't know the system. So by consciously choosing to make that stuff accessible and to make alternative opportunities accessible, you can really equalize things.
I think it's my responsibility as a festival organiser for not only poetry festivals, but also my partner and I do Terrorfest, which is a heavy metal festival, is that we do include people from everywhere, and so that we can have all of those voices heard. And that's my privilege and my responsibility, is to provide a space for not only for people to access information within a new country setting, but also for people within the country to have open access to people from all ethnicities, without making it the, Indigenous night or the Muslim night, but just making it the poetry night or the heavy metal night, and having all of those opinions just aired, and then people can take that in and do what they want with it.
Okay, so when I started, I said I would state my position on the current socio-political climate. We've heard from our fellow panelists today. I'll make some closing remarks about literature and literacy. Nothing that is in contradiction or in opposition to my peers. And then we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes for some questions. We can talk a lot about what we can do in terms of having conversations and opening our minds. I think that only really resolves half the issue, because what we're talking about when we're talking about the steps we take or the measures we take is talking about things that will largely benefit us as individuals. We will grow and we will be more open-minded. I don't know if that will necessarily lead to any kind of reconciliation and treaties with Indigenous people. I don't know if that will lead to changes in detention centres. I don't know if that's going to lead to some kind of radical reformation if all of the people in this room go and have conversations with Muslims, if all of a sudden the climate of Islamophobia is going to disappear. I don't know if that will happen, but I think it would be good for you anyway, so you should probably go and do it. but I will say this, that if you look throughout history, what you will find is that every movement towards freedom and justice was heavily connected with literacy. And the primary example I use of this is the story of Malcolm X, black civil rights leader in the United States, a very famous book called The Autobiography of Malcolm X, maybe the most famous autobiography ever written. And Malcolm X charts his intellectual development through learning to read and write in jail, and that led to his civil rights struggle. And largely, if you look throughout history, you will find that actually every civil rights struggle, regardless of whether it's about gender, race, class, sexuality, disability, has always been connected with very educated people. So what I would argue, have a responsibility to do, and I'm saying this here and now because this is a literary festival, what we have a responsibility to do is not go and write a story from the perspective of an Aboriginal and make a lot of profits of that, but to actually give Indigenous people the tools to tell their own stories, as my peers have pointed out, give migrants the opportunities to have their own voice, to give them representation and the literary tools and the critical tools to represent themselves. Because there is a cycle which I see playing out, and Home and Away is a perfect example, where you will actually meet a lot of white people. Sorry if that's an offensive way to put it. I'm being very simplistic, but you will meet a lot of white people who have very big hearts, who are really good people, who really want change. But actually, what we need, if we're going to see change, is an opportunity for Pacific Islander communities to have a platform, for example, to respond to the work of Chris Lilly. And so the only way we're going to do that, and this is the perfect place to say it, is to give all the people we know the tools, the critical tools, the literary tools, to convey that message and to say what they have to say. That is my closing statement. And on that note, I would like to open up the panel for some questions. Ask me and my peers anything you like. You can ask us broadly or specifically, and you will have to go up to that microphone because we're trying to capture it for future audiences to hear. I didn't want to specify, but yes, the ABC. So if anyone has a question, jump up.
I got a question it's the panel generally. One thing that I've been noticing in my reading of global news is problems with, say, border security and asylum seekers in the global context in Australia. For example, last week, Syria took 200,000 people that joined another several hundred thousand that are already in Turkey. So one thing it's a question for the panel is the whole rhetoric around the asylum seeker problem misguided in the way that it seems so central to our media, and in the context of other countries having very, very enormous numbers and logistic problems to deal with in relatively few resources, and how does that global context affect the way that you conceive of these issues?
Can we go with can we start with Mark?
Yeah. So, I think when you look at Australian policy, you essentially what a deterrence policy is doing is saying that if we have open borders, then we'll be flooded, and we need to control our migration and control our borders, and we need to stop boats and then take people how we choose them. That's essentially what they're saying. It's really interesting because on one side they also say we need to save lives at sea, we can't have people drowning. But on the other side, on the exact same policy called No Advantage, we say we can't have people cheating the system and correct migration and all this kind of thing. I think in terms of the global issue, there is some kind of idea that if we do have open border policies, we'll have to take in a whole lot more. There are people who want to come to Australia and who have the means to come to Australia, who want protection. And if we're going to talk about changing our system into a compassionate one, we have to recognise that will involve taking a lot more refugees. You can't have a compassionate policy that still limits to 20,000 a year. It won't happen. In terms of our responsibility in the globe, we're floundering very, very low down, especially considering the resources we have and the space we have. And so, yeah, when you look at the numbers in the Middle East, the numbers in places like Pakistan, there's a lot we need to do to alleviate that pressure on these countries. Interestingly enough, Tony Abbott said that we would take Iraqi refugees, and while at the same time imprisoning Iraqi asylum seekers who come to Australia by boat in offshore detention centres. I think what it boils down to, for me, from my opinion, on all that I've looked at, we want to decide who comes to our shores and how they come. We want to be able to pick and choose which people come, and we don't want this idea of this uncontrolled migration, which is interesting because we're one of the only countries in the world that have the privilege to do that, because most other countries in the world have porous borders. And so my question back would be, what kind of country do we want to be? Quickly, before I do that, the whole definition of immigration is the selection of people to come to our country. That's what the purpose of immigration is. So do we want to be a country that refuses people protection who need protection based upon this conceived nation of uncontrolled migration? Or do we want to be a compassionate country that comes up with a proper solution, a humane solution, a civilized solution, rather than placing children in prisons where they self-harm?
Before we continue, can I get a show of hands just to see who might want to ask a question? A couple of people? Okay, maybe you can line up so that I can actually work out how much time we should spend on each question. Is that okay? But I feel like there's quite a few. In which case, we'll just go to the next question.
Okay, I'm David. I'm part of the Refugee Action Network in Newcastle. And just please, if you're a poet, a storyteller or a writer, please consider posting it on a Facebook page of a Refugee Action Network, because I think that sharing of ideas and story and that artistic and that literary creativity is really a big part of getting to a better position in this area.
Thank you. There's some stools there as well if you want to take a seat while you wait.
Hi, thanks for doing such a good job speaking. I just had a question. We have this kind of Australian story, like the mythology of Australia, that kind of does come out of a lot of colonial literature and things like that, and it's like eucalyptus trees and pubs and barbecues and all those kind of things. Obviously, there's a bit of a disconnect in how, for instance, migrant families, etc., fit into that story. Considering that story does come out of such a rural part of Australia, which now is perhaps the most resistant to new communities coming into it, like Australian communities. Is that Australian story that we tell ourselves about, like the Aussie battler, etc., is that inherently racist, or is there a way that we can kind of like should people try and take that on when they're coming to Australia, and as writers, when we write about Australian identity and the Australian story, how should we deal with that?
I'm going to start by just telling you what I think, and then I'll hand it over. I don't think it's inherently racist. I think it's inherently white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. Now let's see what my peers have to say.
Wow. It's a really interesting question because, I mean, you're right, a lot of it is founded on that sort of post-colonial or the colonial story. So, like, the Indigenous story is not in any of our story of what Australia is. And I think this is exemplified for me on 2 days, Australia Day and Anzac Day. It's a day where people get most patriotic, but about stuff that's only really 200 years old-ish, and stuff that, part of the country can't relate to at all. And I think the movie Tomorrow When the War Began, there's this one scene, right, that I thought was really interesting, and I only recently watched it. A group of white Aussie kids in a rural part of Australia freaking out because they're being invaded by foreigners. And then the chick sees like a poster of a group of Indigenous people watching the white Australians come, like the Brits come to shore. And it was this juxtaposition of, you're so afraid of this happening to you, and yet you've never really thought about how it affected the people that were already there. Fascinating, I thought. So whether it's inherently racist or not, look, I don't think it's tough, because the moment you start calling people racist or white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy, they get really defensive. And I don't think it's fair for me to put, like, okay, yes, you might want, like, people call it out, but for me, I personally find it more effective to say, okay, this is what you acknowledge as the Australian story, but trying to lead them to a point where to ask them and to make them come to their own sort of conclusion, well, maybe the Australian story isn't what I think it is. Because damn straight the Australian story needs changing. It's not reflective at all of the Australia that we all actually live. But how do you, people hold on to it because it's kind of what they know. One of the guys on the rig said to me, he was like, look, I don't give a shit what you wear. But the fact is, none of us like changing it. And we fear that if we change the story, you're changing who we are. So how do we move people beyond the fear of that change? How do we say, you can still have your barbecues, mate. It's all good. But I'm going to bring my shish kebab, and it'll be right. But how do we change that? I think, it might be slow and it will be difficult for a lot of people, but it has to change to reflect who we actually are.
What do you think, Laurie?
I think that it's already changed. I think there is this concept of the Aussie battler has been and gone, mate. It's done. Aussie battlers now have a TV in their bedroom, their lounge room, fans in their bathroom. The Aussie battler drives the Commodore that cost him $65,000. The Aussie battler has not only one mortgage but two, and they're taking the money from a house they're renting out at $600 a week. This notion of what an Aussie battler is gone, and it's been replaced with cashed up bogans. Basically, I think the Aussie battler is done. Like, as someone who's grown up in housing commission and in total and utter poverty, is that I see these people referring to themselves as Aussie battlers, and I don't get it, because I just don't think it exists. And I think that the Australian story has already changed since we've had all this mining booms, mining booms and tradie booms, because tradies obviously all have very nice utes, that it has changed so much that I think that we are already on our way to progressing and to changing, and that the Australian story has already changed quite dramatically.
Is the problem then that we're not writing that change?
I think that
we are still talking about it like we are a certain way, definitely our politicians are still referring to using the same catchphrases, etc. But
Exactly, because they want to relate to people, and the politicians want to make people, sympathise and go, yeah, that's right, that's what I am. I'm the Aussie battler. And I mean, all you need to do is go to somewhere else, go to a remote community and see what people living in poverty in our own country, and they're the Aussie battlers. They're the ones doing it rough. They're struggling. They are struggling as a direct result of the money that white Australia has made from mining and mining industries and from tearing up the country. And obviously, that's a result of colonialisation.
It's poor leadership. It's because our leadership isn't aspirational. Our leadership is about amplifying, our leadership is about getting re-elected, therefore amplifying the fears that we already have in a way that'll benefit them.
Yeah, I think that the concept of the Aussie battler, totally dead. Everyone can have a barbecue. We love barbecues. That's pretty much what I'm going to say.
Before we take the last question, I'm sorry, I really have to offer my opinion here because, look, in a very literal way, in a very real way, if you go around, visit Sydney, Melbourne, any community in Australia, you'll find that actually it's true that the kind of romantic idea of the Australian, especially in an international perspective, is not the reality. If that's what we're talking about, then yeah, it's true. Australia looks very different now. But the mythology of Australia, especially on an international perspective, is still, Henry Lawson, the rugged white bushman with the hat and the mustache and all that stuff, right? So in a very real way, the question is that mythology still carrying on? Do you know, a couple of weeks ago, Tony Abbott, who I actually think, with all due respect to my distaste for him, is actually doing a very effective job leading the country. He's getting everybody to go along with all the nonsense that's coming out of his mouth. And that's good, he's doing a good job of getting what he wants. So I think he's pretty satisfied with the circumstances as they are right now. But look, the thing about the mythology in relation to the reality is that the other day, Tony Abbott, without much resistance and protest, announced the top 100, Australian achievements and the most significant events in Australian history. And he listed 1788 as the most significant event. Now, the issue here is that we're living where we all live in a country, on a land that has a 60,000-year-old history. It is arguably the most ancient civilized nations on earth from this country. In which case, probably the very first languages developed here, probably the very first artworks developed here, the first forms of mathematics and sciences probably started here. And did Tony Abbott consult with any Indigenous elders when he was deciding what are the most important things? Of course not. Did he care about the 60,000-year-old Indigenous history that existed before he decided what were the most important things? Of course not. He just decided, look, when we got here, the Anglo race, when we dropped our crap here, that's when things became significant on this land. And so I think the problem is that we still do have a romantic idea of it, and we all would really like to see that change because we know now through decades of work that it's nonsense, that it's total rubbish. And I think, again, I'm going to say literacy is the way to change that. Give people literacy and the rest will sort itself out. Can we have the last question?
I'm very interested in the idea of how to preach to the unconverted, which is what you were touching on before. Like you might have a night about poetry, about Indigenous matters, but people who are interested in poetry and Indigenous matters will come. Just like a writers' festival, people interested in writing will come to that. But I'm really interested in how literature can specifically target people who are not already exposed to that, which is what is the most important thing in change, I think.
This is the last question. I know we're running out of time. How about everybody answer? So
Okay.
all four of us will offer an answer.
Just really quickly, I think that it's important to make events like you will have people come to a spoken word night or to a hip hop night or a metal night expecting a certain type of metal or a certain genre, but they're not going to expect different views from different people. So I think it's the job of organisers of festivals, writers' events, publishers, radio producers, any form of media producer. I think it is their responsibility to make sure that events are inclusive and have all voices from everywhere, as many voices and different stories as humanly possible, and then because then you're going to reach a wider audience and you're going to reach more people, and it's rather than have like the Indigenous poetry night and you'll only get people who like that will come to that event, but have it just so that it's like a free-for-all, basically.
So this is pretty much the story of my life. All the places that I work on mine sites, I work on oil rigs. I work everywhere where people are like, you don't belong here. I remember being at an airport and there was an Asian bloke and I was like, God, he looks different. And I was like, oh wait, that's what I look like. So I think part of it is putting yourself in positions. If you have a viewpoint that's different to a certain group, putting yourself in positions where you don't share the views of everyone else, and trying to understand where they're coming from, and then speaking in a language that they understand. And I find that, especially for broadly Australians, people don't like sort of being told what to think, as I said before, and they don't like confrontation. They don't like being kind of preached at. I think that's something that people particularly dislike. But I'm all about having people have different conversations, and so kind of like subtly sneaking it in there. And again, I remember a guy at work once saying to me, he was like, you're really radical. And I'm like, don't use that word about me. And he was like, no, but what I mean is that you make us talk about stuff that we wouldn't usually talk about. I'm like, what, apart from hunting and fishing and chicks? Like, but the thing is I'll just ask them different questions, or and a lot of the time people don't take the time to think about these sort of things, because if it doesn't affect them, then why would they spend the time thinking about it? So it's just about asking them a question that's slightly different. It's about maybe bringing old mate Mohammed from down the road to hang out with the boys, and they'll just, they'll spend the first hour or so being like, dude, what the hell? And then they'll just be like, oh yeah, you like motorbikes too, or whatever it may be, and letting that be organic. And so it's about, unfortunately, it's about packaging it in a way that is not confrontational, but allowing people to come to their own conclusions, and hopefully the right kind of conclusions, and also, encouraging them to think differently, and also providing different forms of media for them. So I'm a big fan of sending a random link about, like a YouTube link about something that they wouldn't necessarily watch on the newsfeed, to someone that I know holds a particular opinion, be like, mate, just for me, just watch it. And then they might not, but the thing is you plant a seed in their mind. So the next time they're faced with something, they might be like, oh yeah, but I saw that thing that was a little bit different. So like that constant exposure, and not doing it in a way that, that'll shut people off straight away, I think is the way that I've found personally to be effective.
So I think if you look at civil rights movements throughout time, they're long, arduous processes that take a lot of fight and a lot of heart. And if you look at the gay rights movement, women's rights movements, civil rights movements in America, they're still fighting, and they will continue to fight. And so I don't think, if we look at it, it's not an issue of changing minds. It's actually just trying to get the voices out there at this stage. I'm just in terms of the asylum seeker movement, and I think it needs a saturation of the media. You need consistent, continual message, even if it's journaling the same thing. Asylum seekers are people too. They deserve rights. That consistent message to go out there. It needs, to empower, as Mohammed was saying, empower the people to be doing it themselves. It needs people like me doing it. It needs people like Yassmin and Laurie doing it. It needs everyone coming together. And if you consistently present that message, rather than just that one-off time saying, oh yeah, that people can forget it. If it eventually gets into the mainstream media, then you can start influencing those people who wouldn't usually come to a creative writers festival. Because I think that's what I've found with my work. How do I bring people to speak to listen to me when all I'm doing is talking at refugee forums and writers festivals and charity groups? The next level is that by consistently presenting this message, I've now been invited to schools and universities and colleges and TAFEs, places where people are open to learning and open to new ideas, where you can educate. And I think always, always, always the important message to the kids. Interestingly, when I went to it was your mum's school, I said to the kids, if you wanted to save lives at sea and stop people drowning by getting on boats from Indonesia to Australia, what would you do? They said, put them on planes. Getting kids, accessing kids, they have that core humanity inside them before they've been tainted.
The question was, how do you reach people who are not converted? I'll make the final remark, and then we'll conclude. And I really only have one answer. Anyone that isn't converted that you want to convert, just get them to listen to Tupac. On that note, I mean it. I really mean it. On that note, thank you. With all the new laws that have passed, we're probably all going to get arrested. Mm-hmm. So see ya. Have a nice life and see you later.
Or not.